Investigation will come to order. Today's hearing is entitled Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, Stakeholders' Perspective. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time, and without objection, members of the full committee who are not members of this subcommittee may participate in today's hearing for the purpose of making an opening statement and questioning our witnesses. The chair now recognizes herself for 4 minutes for an opening statement. The Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, CDBG-DR, provides communities much-needed access to resources in order to rebuild in the wake of natural disasters. Today's hearing, which is appropriately titled Stakeholders' Perspectives, is the second CDBG-DR oversight hearing held by this subcommittee in the 115th Congress. Members of the subcommittee will hear testimony on the challenges that exist with the CDBG-DR program in its current form and discuss actions Congress might consider that increase both the accountability of appropriated funds and help to deliver them to affected communities. While Congress has recently appropriated over $35 billion in CDBG-DR funds for victims of storms primarily in Florida, Texas, and Puerto Rico, members of this subcommittee should demand that any dollar designated for disaster relief is being effectively spent on victims. In testimony before the subcommittee last November, the Acting Inspector General for Housing and Urban Development, HUD, noted that while flexibility is important in the wake of disaster, CDBG-DR funds often go towards programs or recipients for whom they are not originally intended. The acting IG indicated that HUD faces significant challenges in monitoring CDBG-DR funds provided to various grantees under its purview, in part because HUD at times waives certain program requirements and grantees may have a lack of understanding of disaster assistance. The acting IG also testified that victims of disaster may encounter a variety of challenges throughout the disaster assistance process, which include potential duplication of benefits, slow disbursement of the disaster-related funding, and delays in funding for low and moderate income citizens. While HUD has become a primary provider of disaster recovery, the program is not codified in statute. Instead, HUD uses more than 60 Federal Register notices to issue clarifying guidance, waivers, and alternative requirements to both its entitlement and state CDBG-DR programs to oversee at least 113 active disaster recovery grants, which total more than $47 billion. To put it bluntly, the disaster recovery program is a bit of a disaster. I am eager to hear testimony today that will discuss the value of codifying the program in statute, because I strongly believe codifying a single disaster recovery program would provide a template or framework for future disasters. It would reduce the over-reliance on the plethora of Federal Register notices and other informal forms of guidance for each disaster, and speedy delivery of disaster assistance for grantees and, more importantly, for our disaster victims. Finally, I just want to take a moment to thank Ranking Member Green for his support in legislation that we have been working together on for a number of months. I look forward to furthering those discussions as well as hearing recommendations from our witnesses this morning. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I now wish to recognize my friend, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's indeed a privilege to work with you on these projects. I also, and I think you will concur, think that we should thank our staffs. They have been working tirelessly to make sure that we cover all of our bases, and notwithstanding all of the effort, I'm sure that there'll be some things that we just won't be able to get to. But I'm grateful that you have not only worked with me in a very coordinated fashion, but also you have embraced this hearing with a great degree of alacrity, and that means a lot to me. To the witnesses, I'm grateful that you are here today. This is very important. We need to hear from you because you've had a hands-on experience with these events, these natural disasters, if you will. And it's important that we hear from you about these things. I think for the people who may be watching us at home, it's important for me to say that this is not, NOT, this is not a how much hearing. And I'm saying this because many times after hearings, I'll have persons who will ask me, why didn't you bring up something that was important as it relates to them? And there are many people who want to know how much money will we allocate? How much can they expect? And this is not a how much hearing. This is more about how shall we? How shall we deliver what the Congress appropriates? Shall there be a paradigm that has reasonable expectations codified within it such that municipalities, counties, states can have a reasonable expectation as to how to proceed so that they can have an efficacious result? This is an important hearing. It's exceedingly important that we understand some of the things that victims have had to endure. And I'm sure some of you will have anecdotal evidence about the victims and how they have had to cope with certain circumstances over a prolonged period of time. I concur with the chairwoman when she said that we want to make sure that we take care of the victims. The money should get to them, and it should get to them as expeditiously and efficiently as possible. And that's what she and I would like to see, and I fully support this. I also want to mention one other thing that is important that won't be a part of this hearing, and that is how HUD will handle things, how HUD handles the dollars. I'm saying this to you in this sense. I know that HUD will be understaffed when we have these natural disasters, and there possibly is a need for HUD to staff up to meet the demands that are imposed when we have these circumstances. And that's something that we'll have to deal with here in Congress. But I know, and I want people to know, that I'm concerned about this. I also want to mention direct funding. This is an issue that I have been grappling with, and in trying to find a way to get the end beneficiary, those who have been victimized, how to get to them the dollars, the funding, the appropriations as quickly as possible. We have been grappling with the question of direct funding. And how do you get that to a municipality, a county that can actually handle the dollars that will be sent? It's one thing to receive the dollars, and it's another thing to be able to account for them after they have been spent. That accounting process requires much more than a good many small to medium-sized municipalities can cope with. So we want to make sure that we don't impose upon some venues a process that they won't be able to manage effectively. And finally this, as we proceed with the hearing today, it's going to be very important that I and others, that we give a good deal of concern, in my opinion, for those who not only live and thrive in the sweets of life, but also those who live and survive in the streets of life. There are people in my city who go home to an overpass. There are people in my city who go home to a bed of bedrock. There are people in my city who are victimized by these disasters, these monsters, that don't have the opportunity to benefit to the extent that I think that they should from the taxpayer-funded aid. So I'll be concerned about how we help those that I consider the least, the last, and the lost. With this, Madam Chair, I gladly yield to you, and I thank you so much for the time.
Chair now recognizes the Vice Chair of the Oversight Investigations Subcommittee, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, for 1 minute for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Wagner, and appreciate you holding a hearing on today's important topic, and appreciate the comments made by the ranking member that it's not only the dollars but the accountability of those dollars. In my home state of Colorado, community development block grants for disaster recovery have been used for flood and fire recovery programs. These programs address housing, infrastructure, planning, and economic development needs and have proven to be effective tools in responding to the aftermath of a disaster. However, as for effective as these dollars may have been in helping to meet the needs of post-disaster communities, we must be sure that we practice the most prudent stewardship of taxpayer dollars. I look forward to the hearing and the witness testimony about how the CDBG-DR dollars have been administered in specific state examples, and more generally across the country. I look forward to continuing to work with Chair Wagner and the ranking member toward a solution that provides greater accountability. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We now welcome our witnesses, some who have come from a great deal of time and distance. The chair now recognizes the ranking member from Texas, Mr. Green, to introduce today's first three witnesses.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. I see this opportunity to introduce the witnesses as a further indication of the bipartisanship that we have engendered. I am honored, Madam Chair, to introduce first Mr. Stephen Costello. Let me start by indicating that Houston, as you know, has had many unfortunate circumstances with rain, and to the extent that he is affectionately known as the flood czar. His official title is the Chief Resiliency Officer for the City of Houston. He is a former city council member at large. In Houston, we have single-member districts, and we have at-large seats. He was a person who represented the entirety of the city in his city council capacity. He is an engineer, civil. I was a person who attended school to become a mechanical engineer. It's my understanding that a mechanical engineer is a civil engineer with his brains beat out. So it's an honor to be in your company today. I also further understand that he has done something that can benefit all of us. He's worked with the Army Corps of Engineers, and of course he is the co-founder of Costello Engineering and Surveying, a civil engineering firm. The next witness is someone that I've known for many years. He and I are proteges, if I may say so, of the Honorable Mickey Leland, who represented the 18th Congressional District from the state of Texas. He has worked with Lieutenant Governor Bill Harvey in the past. He was a law clerk to Chief Justice John Phillips of the Third Court of Appeals. He has served on city council, having been elected at a very early age of 29. He has been elected to the Senate of the state of Texas, and he recently left the Senate to become a county commissioner, one of the most sought-after positions in Texas. People will leave Congress to become a county commissioner. And his name is, of course, Rodney Ellis, very dear friend. Thank you. My chief of staff reminded me that you probably ought to mention his name, Congressman. Ms. Heather LaGrone, a person that we truly respect and are honored to have with us today, because she is the person who works with the CDBG-DR, slight tongue twister for some of us, not all. But in any event, the DR funds, and she works as a deputy director for the Community Development and Revitalization for the Texas Land Commission office. This is a pretty important office in my life right now, because they are, of course, dealing with the DR funds, and I must tell you, I think that they are going to do a great job, and I would like for her boss to know that we appreciate his efforts and what he's doing in this endeavor. She has a degree in urban geography from Texas A&M University. We are both Aggies in the sense that I went to Florida A&M University, Tallahassee. She has 15 years of experience with CDBG and the CDBG-DR programs. She manages the day-to-day operations. You can't have any more hands-on experience than that, of the program, totaling over $3 billion. We're honored to have all three, and Madam Chair, I yield back to you.
Gentleman yields back. Our final two witnesses for today's hearing are Carlos Martin and Marion McFadden. Dr. Martin is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, where he leads research on the physical quality of housing and communities. As a trained architect and engineer, his area of expertise includes green housing, disaster mitigation, substandard housing, and construction workforce. Ms. McFadden is Vice President of Public Policy at Enterprise Community Partners. Before her current position, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs as the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development from 2014 through 2016, and oversaw affordable housing and community development programs, including the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, NSP, and the CDBG Disaster Recovery Funds. The witnesses will now be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of their testimony. And without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made part of the record following their oral remarks. Once the witnesses have finished presenting their testimony, each member of the subcommittee will have 5 minutes within which to ask questions. With that, Mr. Costello, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair and honorable committee members. My name, for record, is Stephen Costello, and I am the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Houston. And I'm here today on behalf of our Mayor, Sylvester Turner. And thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective regarding the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Relief Program. Before I address the specific topic, I do want to expand a little bit upon my resume that Congressman Green put forth. I've been in this business for over 40 years, starting in 1977 as a civilian working for the Army Corps of Engineers. Come from private practice. I served on council for 6 years. I was a budget chairman for 5 of those 6 years. And I advocated for investment in infrastructure and was instrumental in the passage of Renew Houston, an $8 billion 20-year infrastructure funding investment for drainage improvements. In 2015, facing term limits, I unsuccessfully ran for mayor against my current mayor, Mayor Turner. During the early months of Mayor Turner's tenure, I was honored for his consideration for the possibility of my return to the city. During this time, the city experienced what we commonly call the tax day flood, April of 2016, the third massive flood in less than 18 months. As a result, I decided to join the mayor's staff as a Chief Resiliency Officer, and he tasked me with the role of working primarily on flooding and drainage, even though my title is Chief Resilience Officer. Publicly, he gave me the term flood czar, which everybody currently uses. Currently, my main duties are to interface with external agencies, county, state, and federal agencies, as well as internal city departments on flooding and drainage projects. With respect to the topic under consideration by this subcommittee, I respectfully offer these comments based on recent experiences with Hurricane Ike and 2015 flood recovery funds. Upon assuming my current position, I was asked to assist in completing several infrastructure projects identified in the 2008 Hurricane Ike Disaster Relief Action Plan. These projects are still ongoing and are expected to be completed in June of 2019, 12 years post the hurricane. Several reasons can be attributed to the delay. However, the primary issue is associated with the establishment flow of recovery funds from HUD to the state or the local metropolitan planning organization, and ultimately down to the city. A more positive experience has demonstrated the success of direct allocation. In 2016, the city received $66.5 million of direct allocation from HUD for assistance in 2015 flood recovery. The approved action plan distributed the funds amongst infrastructure, home repair, housing buyout, and planning and administrative activities. In May of 2017, Congress allocated an additional $20.5 million directly to the city for infrastructure and administrative expenses. Having the direct allocation of $87 million afforded the city the opportunity to expedite, and I want to repeat that, expedite projects in affected areas. For example, by working closely with our sister agency, Harris County Flood Control District, we have been able to leverage a housing buyout dollars and provide those funds to our sister agency to expedite the buyout in the city of Houston. Additionally, the city has leveraged funds by collaborating with another sister agency, Harris County Engineering Department, on drainage infrastructure projects in the Spring Branch area of the City of Houston, where both agencies will share in the cost of construction. Finally, 2 residential areas impacted by the 2015 flood, where we had ongoing drainage projects, we were able to leverage additional HUD funds to increase the scope of the project and the size of the impacted area, which really was a tremendous impact to the project. This process, as of today, we anticipate expending all of the 2015 dollars within 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years as compared to 12 years for a Hurricane Ike recovery. The comparison of Ike recovery in 2015 flood recovery demonstrates how direct allocation has been more efficient for project delivery and completion as it removes multiple layers of involvement in the management of recovery funds. Still, it is important to recognize that the success of implementation of an action plan may also be attributed to the expertise of the recipient. The City of Houston is the 4th largest city in the United States with a public works department alone of over 4,000 people, with expertise related to disaster recovery and action plan implementation and project delivery. We understand, though, that there are much smaller municipalities that are impacted by floods where technical expertise is not readily available and could continue to benefit from the important role that the state or the local MPO plays. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify before the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations this morning, and I look forward to future questions from Madam Chair and the committee members. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Costello. Commissioner Ellis, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Wagner, Ranking Member Green, and other members of the committee. My name is Rodney, and I'm one of the 5 people on the governing board for Harris County. Our base city is Houston. It is the 3rd largest county in the country. I learned years ago in the state legislature, if somebody said something that you want to say, you don't have to say it again. So I just want to reiterate 3 basic points. 1, it will be helpful to extend the deadline for expediting funds to speed up delivery dollars. After Hurricane Ike, it took 2 years to begin repairing homes. 2nd, the Secretary may directly allocate funding to cities and counties. We want you to find a way to do anything you can to further remove bureaucratic hurdles that the committee considers a problem with direct allocation to entities that can handle the administrative workload. One suggestion, this is just for me, would be maybe entities at above 2 million people if they can handle the administrative workload. That's just an arbitrary number of 2 million. At least I'm not just trying to cover my county because we are approaching 5 million. Thirdly, the 70% low to moderate income requirement has ensured that these dollars go to the communities most in need. I hope that you will consider leaving the discretion with the Secretary to lower that threshold to 50%. And I would encourage the committee to preserve that provision with the discretion of the Secretary. Within my precinct, from the latest event, disaster event, there were 24,000 structures that were flooded, tens of thousands of cars were lost, and many of my constituents are still struggling to get back on their feet. Across our entire region, including Houston and other communities, we were impacted severely. We had 80 deaths, more than 1 million people were displaced, and roughly 200,000 homes in the path were damaged, stretching for more than 300 miles. CDBG-DR dollars are a vital aspect of bringing our region around in the long term as well as the short term. State and local governments know what's best for them after a community has been impacted, and the CDBG-DR dollars will allow us to have a great deal of discretion in determining how to effectively respond to crises. After Hurricane Ike, Harris County received its housing contract on September 1st, 2009, almost a year after Hurricane Ike. But we did not receive approval from the state of Texas to proceed with the program guidelines until September 1st, 2010. Harris County's post-Ike home repair program took an average of 3 years to complete. All construction and multifamily programs average 6 to 8 years. Infrastructure projects average 6 years, including 6 months just to close out projects with the state of Texas. In fact, due to issues beyond the county's control, we still have 2 Hurricane Ike CDBG-DR projects under construction nearly 10 years later. issues like lawsuits and other issues that would come up. I would encourage the committee to look at a direct allocation from the Secretary for Disaster Recovery Funding for local governments with a population of a certain amount and administrative capability of a certain amount, because it makes it easier for us to respond in a speedy fashion to people. And I think, at least privately, many of my colleagues with the state who I worked with when I was a state senator and even now in county government would agree if a local community has the administrative capacity, it works better for both sides. Finally, I want to reiterate that 70% versus 50% issue gently one more time. I know oftentimes it's easier for us to respond to the people who are loudest, and they tend to not be the people who are most in need. Lastly, I want to thank you again for that $35 billion on behalf of my community and all of the communities in this country that were impacted. Thank you.
Thank you for testimony, Mr. Ellis. Ms. LaGrone, you're now recognized for your 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Just for the record, I am Heather LaGrone. I'm the Deputy Director for Community Development and Revitalization for the Texas General Land Office. Just as a reminder, on August the 25th, 2017, a strengthening Category 4 Hurricane Harvey made landfall in Nueces County, Texas, between Port Aransas and Port O'Connor, with sustained winds of over 135 miles per hour. During this period, as much as 60 inches of rain fell over the 49-county impact area. Harvey slowly meandered its way north by northeast and finally dissipated in September the 3rd. The Texas General Land Office estimates that the cost of the damages for Hurricane Harvey at over $120 billion, making it the costliest event in U.S. history. The hurricane shut down ports, trade, tourism, oil and gas production, agricultural production, general business across the state's coast for almost a week, and in some cases for significantly longer. The impact of these interruptions is difficult to quantify, but the effects of this disaster were felt across the nation, with commodities such as gas increasing in price by 33 cents a gallon in the weeks following Hurricane Harvey. The GLO estimates that over 1 million homes were impacted by Hurricane Harvey. On September the 14th of 2017, Governor Abbott designated Commissioner George P. Bush and his agency, the Texas General Land Office, to be the state's lead for short-term housing recovery with FEMA and long-term infrastructure and housing rebuilding through HUD. We continue this mission today. The short-term housing activities are wrapping up, and we are preparing to transition into long-term recovery. On February the 9th, 2018, HUD allocated just over $5 billion in CDBG-DR funds to the state of Texas in response to Hurricane Harvey. That $5 billion allocated is from a $15 billion allocation that was appropriated by Congress on September the 8th, 2017. The GLO has completed the action plan defining the uses of just over $2.7 billion from this allocation, and it is with HUD for their review and approval. First, I would like to thank Congress for how quickly the first funds were allocated for Hurricane Harvey's recovery. 2 short weeks after Hurricane Harvey made landfall, over $7.4 billion in CDBG funds had been allocated. But long-term recovery is a process that takes too long. There are some things that could be done that would shorten the process and allow impacted states to at least begin their recovery sooner, and I would like to share those with you now. States need to be allowed the maximum level of flexibility possible for disaster recovery efforts. Hurricane Harvey impacted 49 counties in an area larger than the state of Indiana, and at least 3 different types of events. In the coastal Bend area, Harvey was a true hurricane with wind speeds in excess of 130 miles per hour. In Houston, it was a rain event that created flooding that had never been seen. In southeast Texas, it dropped many feet of rain that did not drain for weeks to follow. The recovery needs to be tailored to the needs of each impact area and locally driven through a state oversight. HUD's formula allocated funds to population centers, and then the Federal Register all but required direct housing activities be considered over any other kind of need nearly 6 months after landfall. Requiring HUD to allocate funds from any appropriation within 60 days, as was done with the more recent allocation, would be encouraged to continue. This would allow states the funds to start their recovery while data commonly used by HUD to allocate those funds can be finalized. Disasters do not discriminate, and HUD defined higher income but still working class families are often equally impacted. HUD's recent shift away from waiving the LMI aggregate from 70% to 50% for disaster events will prevent communities from being able to recover in a holistic way. It has also made large-scale infrastructure projects that could mitigate large areas for future events very difficult. Historically, CDBG funds have provided grantees with 5% in administrative cost. This value is generally adequate. However, HUD has continued to increase the level of oversight, reporting, and IT requirements on these awards. This is especially evident in allocations resulting in smaller, localized events. In this recent allocation, HUD limited the support of families who reside in a floodplain who made 120% of the area median income if they did not maintain flood insurance. The state is concerned that this could progress beyond just families located in the floodplain. As I said, disaster events do not discriminate, nor do they consider income. In Texas, we have many families residing outside the floodplain who thought they had all the appropriate insurance coverage necessary be impacted by flooding and lose everything. For a family of 4 living in Beaumont, Texas, 120% of the area median income would be $66,600. which is hardly enough income to recover from the complete loss of your home. Lastly, disaster recovery could be greatly expedited if HUD had written regulations that governed the supplemental CDBG-DR allocations. States would not have to guess at what regulations would be applicable from event to event, nor would they wait for the Federal Register to be published to begin the program and design of their action plans. The GLO, we are currently managing 7 CDBG-DR grants that have different rules and regulations. I have been involved in disaster recovery for the state of Texas since Hurricane Katrina and Rita in 2005. I have to say, HUD has been a strong partner who has been very supportive of our recovery efforts, and we are offering these suggestions for improvement on the program that we have benefited greatly from in Texas. We believe that making these adjustments to the program could expedite recovery and utilize limited funding more efficiently. At this time, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Legrone. Dr. Martin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairwoman Wagner, Ranking Member Green, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to highlight the evidence base regarding stakeholders' perspectives on CDBG-DR. My name is Carlos Martin, and I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. The views I express today are my own and should not be attributed to the Urban Institute, its trustees, or its funders. CDBG-DR has increased in importance within U.S. disaster response since its first use in 1993. This was demonstrated by its inscription in the 2011 National Disaster Recovery Framework. The program also plays a unique role in that response by contextualizing recovery within longer-term planning and housing needs. My research focuses on the state and local governments that receive program grants, and in turn on their outcomes across households and communities. My colleagues and I have examined the many challenges state and local governments face. Among local factors that pose challenges are the pre-disaster capacity of the grantee staff, the severity of the disaster, and the clarity of a community's post-disaster goals. We have also looked at the nature of the program's authorized activities and regulations, separate from how HUD administers them. 2 characteristics pose consistent challenges. 1, the program's final position in the sequence of federal post-disaster response, and 2, the program's lack of permanent statutory authority. Snapshots from this year's devastations echo what our research shows. Communities that have just experienced a disaster, like those in Texas, Florida, Puerto Rico, and California, are tasked with piecing together resources to put their residents, economies, and cultures back on their collective feet. Each set of those resources brings with it a slew of different requirements, regulations, and stakeholders that can test even the most sophisticated and well-resourced state and municipal officials. This is happening while jurisdictions have ongoing questions about the federal assistance they have received so far, and while they grapple with long-term goals, land use decisions, and infrastructure plans. The burden on state and local governments' capacity is particularly heavy at this point in their recovery. However, it is made heavier by the fact that they may not know the full regulatory parameters or the magnitude of the assistance that CDBG-DR provides. In some cases after disaster, they may not know whether Congress will appropriate that assistance and HUD will allocate it. As the federal backstop for recovery, the program accommodates all previous programs' constraints after many response and rebuilding decisions have already occurred, and when communities' expectations are fraying. At its best, CDBG-DR is a bridge from the shock and chaos of disaster back to the path of prosperity and development on which all communities in the U.S. travel. Yet that bridge has always been temporary. Future disasters are certain. Equal certainty in the federal response to these disasters will improve how our communities recover qualitatively and quantitatively. Thanks again for the opportunity to share my research. I look forward to the subcommittee's questions.
Thank you, Dr. Martine. Ms. McFadden, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Wagner, Ranking Member Green, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the CDBG-DR program. I'm Marian McFadden. I serve as the Vice President for Public Policy at Enterprise Community Partners, a nonprofit organization committed to making well-designed homes affordable. For more than 35 years, Enterprise has helped to build organizational capacity in both the public and private sectors. Last year, we harnessed $7.2 billion in capital to help create or preserve more than 60,000 homes. Enterprise has worked with communities to help rebuild from disasters since Hurricane Katrina, when we established an office on the Gulf Coast to assist in Louisiana and Mississippi's recovery. We assisted New Jersey and New York after Hurricane Sandy, supported the state of Colorado after severe flooding in 2013, and we're currently working on recovery initiatives in Texas, Florida, California, Puerto Rico, and the United States Virgin Islands. Personally, I worked on disaster recovery at HUD, dating all the way back to 9/11, including as legal counsel for the CDBG program and Deputy Assistant Secretary for grant programs, where I was directly responsible for the administration of the CDBG-DR program. Today, I'd like to highlight 3 things: the importance of CDBG-DR to urban, suburban, and rural communities, the benefits of mitigating future risk, and opportunities to strengthen the CDBG-DR program, making it more efficient and thus faster and less expensive for communities to recover. As the frequency and intensity of natural disasters has increased, CDBG-DR has become an essential component of long-term recovery. After major catastrophes, CDBG-DR is the difference maker for families and small businesses. For property owners whose insurance proceeds, FEMA grants, and small business homeowner loans have been insufficient to repair their homes or get them to stable housing. CDBG-DR pays for repairs and rebuilding of apartment buildings. It allows small businesses to retool to meet the needs of a changed economy. CDBG-DR dollars repair damaged infrastructure and reopen hospitals, schools, and shopping centers. CDBG-DR is often used as leverage for private capital as well as other public funds. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, Enterprise and our partners combined HUD grants with significant private capital to redevelop public housing through the use of the low-income housing tax credit. CDBG-DR is particularly valuable because it allows states and localities to rebuild in a forward-facing manner, rebuilding stronger and safer so that federal dollars do not put people back in harm's way or throw good money after bad. Mitigation measures have been proven to more than pay for themselves, yielding an average of $6 in future disaster recovery costs for every dollar spent on mitigation. At Enterprise, we saw those savings firsthand last summer when a very heavy rainfall flooded New Orleans and residents found their streets waist-deep in water. Our CDBG-DR funded Faubourg-Lafitte development escaped harm because homes were built an additional 2 feet above the base flood elevation. Water didn't breach the first floor, so there was no need to make a claim on the National Flood Insurance Program policy. While building 2 feet above the base flood elevation was not required at the time, HUD now wisely requires that level of elevation, and we recommend that Congress codify these standards for both CDBG-DR and for non-disaster funds. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to highlight one major challenge with the CDBG-DR program, which is the amount of time it takes for HUD funds to reach communities after a disaster. As you well know, after each unique CDBG-DR appropriation, there's a delay in the flow of funds because HUD must write a new set of waivers and requirements to guide grantees, in addition to assessing the damage and identifying unmet needs. Grantees then need to learn the new rules, make policy choices, and stand up their own disaster recovery programs before projects can even begin. The permanent authorization of CDBG-DR would allow HUD to write regulations, create pre-approved model housing programs, and develop systems that grantees could quickly customize and adopt to shorten the amount of time it takes to get people home again, while increasing necessary protections against fraud, waste, and abuse. Permanent authorization could also solidify policies in areas that have previously been treated inconsistently. Enterprise recommends that Congress take the following steps in permanently authorizing the CDBG-DR program. Better prepare communities to administer taxpayer dollars by expanding HUD's ability to support that administration. This can be accomplished by authorizing additional permanent career HUD staff dedicated full-time to disaster recovery work and through a set-aside for capacity building and technical assistance in all CDBG-DR appropriations. We ask that you also require HUD to allocate a portion of assistance within 60 days, direct HUD to design pre-approved model programs and systems that grantees can take off the shelf and implement wholesale, and ensure that grant funds reach those who need them most. More detail is provided in my written testimony. In closing, the federal government and impacted communities have learned important lessons from recent major recovery efforts, but change has been incremental. It needs to be swifter and more comprehensive. I look forward to working with you to accomplish that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McFadden. The chair now thanks all the witnesses for their opening statements, and I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. McFadden, I'm going to jump around here a little bit, so please bear with me as I want to cover a few different topics. In my opening remarks, I mentioned that HUD primarily uses Federal Register notices to issue clarifying guidance and waivers and alternative requirements for the CDBG-DR program. Given this statement, can you elaborate a little bit for the subcommittee about some of the examples of how not having a law in statute has hurt potential grantees of CDBG-DR funds?
As Congress has passed laws over time, they've changed. So HUD has not done any efforts to do a guiding set of regulations because it hasn't had a single starting point. So as each disaster appropriation is passed, HUD takes a look at the last set of rules but makes changes. Those changes may be influenced by a change in leadership or change in administration, or they may be influenced by lessons learned from previous disasters, but at no moment can a jurisdiction know what the next set of rules is going to include.
Moving on to duplication of benefits, how do the various agencies providing federal assistance coordinate their efforts so that their funding isn't duplicated? For instance, how does HUD know whether SBA provided assistance so that it does not duplicate funding?
So HUD primarily puts the responsibility on the grantees of funds, so the states, cities—
I'm sorry, on whom?
The states, cities, and counties that are receiving the dollars then have a responsibility to coordinate with the SBA, with FEMA, potentially with insurance, philanthropic funds, and other places. There's no streamlined system available, and finding a way to share data more efficiently would absolutely speed up the delivery of assistance.
Delivery to victims at the end of the day. Is there any hierarchical list of funding sources that allows agencies distributing disaster aid to know when to provide money and when not to duplicate others' efforts?
The Stafford Act contains a hierarchy of assistance, but because the CDBG disaster recovery program is essentially a one-off every time, it's not included in that hierarchy. Permanently authorizing CDBG would allow it to take a permanent place in that order of assistance.
Do you know if there is any statutory authority that describes the funding or delivery sequence at all?
Only in the Stafford Act, ma'am.
In the staff guide?
In the, excuse me, in the Stafford Act,
Stafford Act, I'm sorry.
which governs Permanent Disaster Recovery Authority.
One of the major themes that came out of our hearing with the acting HUD IG was the lack of funding and the lack of staff at both HUD and the Inspector General's office to conduct proper oversight. Can you quickly talk about how these additional resources can help to prevent the waste, fraud, and abuse?
In my many years at HUD, I heard from many disaster recovery grantees, so those units that were receiving government, we want more HUD staff time. But the reality is that the HUD Disaster Recovery Unit has far less than 20 people in it at any given moment. They're stretched very thin, and so they only can devote a limited amount of time. Allowing more permanent staff and additional resources for technical assistance and capacity building so that they can rely on experts to assist communities would absolutely strengthen the program.
Lastly, Ms. Legrone, in your testimony, you noted the importance of making sure states knew what the regulations were for CDBG-DR allocations in order to begin work on their action plans. If the CDBG-DR program was codified in law, how would that have changed your response to the most recent storms? For example, how long after Harvey did HUD publish Federal Register notices? How can the process be improved overall?
Absolutely. Thank you, ma'am. The Federal Register for the appropriation that came out on September 8th didn't come out until February. So from September to February, we were looking at previous Federal Registers that we had
That's
worked
6 months.
under. Yes, ma'am. We were looking to previous Federal Registers to try to guess at what that program was going to look like. We had an action plan developed. We were ready to go when that Federal Register came out, but there were some changes in the Federal Register that we weren't expecting, so we had to go back to the drawing board in a couple of places and rewrite language into our action plan. So that did delay us being able to publish the action plan and get it out. HUD can't allocate the funds until they have the data that they need to determine who needs how much money. And they were trying to compare us to Maria and Irma's events. And so they were waiting for data to become available. The most recent allocation and appropriation that y'all have voted on had a 60-day window that required HUD to at least start initiating awards. We are definitely in favor of that, because even if they had just given us $1 billion, $2 billion of the $5 billion we ultimately got, we could have started our programs months sooner, knowing full well that our event was a big enough event to qualify for at least that much money.
Thank you. My time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, our great state of Missouri, for 5 minutes, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member Green. I'd like to get a couple of you to respond to this, Mr. Costello and Councilman, Senator, Commissioner Ellis, and Ms. McFadden. 14 years ago, or almost, when I was sworn in here along with Ranking Member, my wife and I went all over this area trying to find a place that we could buy. One of our former members of this committee, Mel White, had said, you know, why don't you rent, why don't you buy? Foolishly, we didn't. I ended up moving over to the Methodist building across the street. And now I can't afford to live here. The area where we looked at the time was, on Washington standards, very affordable. But now the Nationals have a baseball stadium there. There are restaurants I can't afford to eat in, all over in that area, new apartments. Congresswoman, Beatty lives there, and others. But the problem is that it's happening all over the country. and it's hard to argue against, but the gentrification is occurring. When we were first elected, Capitol Hill was quite different than it is today. And I find myself wondering as I walk 333 steps from my apartment to the Capitol every day, where did those people go? And where are they living today? When I was mayor, we had 2 500-year floods in 3 years in Kansas City, and as ranking member, as the chair, Congresswoman Wagner will recall, it hit St. Louis and Kansas City. We're 200 miles apart, but it devastated both cities. And one of the problems was that, you know, that in the areas where the flood hit, we didn't have the HUD policy, Ms. McFadden, that we have as it relates to one-for-one replacement, which is a HUD policy, has been a policy since maybe the 90s, and that is if you eliminate a HUD property, you have to rebuild. Every one you eliminate or rebuild, you have to rebuild another. Because when the storm hit New Orleans, we had that policy in place. Well, the point is, the problem is exacerbated when it's a flood. I mean, even without a flood, it's a problem. So I wonder what's going on, and what do we need to do as it relates to people who are messed over, first by the flood, and then by the fact that after it's over, they can't even find housing. Please, somebody help us.
Well, Congressman, I'll start. And our mayor has identified, when he came into office, what he calls a complete communities program, where some of these communities that are possibly threatened from gentrification, that he wants to make sure that we provide services to that complete community and to help build up that community, to make sure that those residents that live there will stay there, whether it's pre-flood or post-flood. So that's what we're doing now, in particular with some of these disaster relief funds. We're allocating projects into these communities. But it's not only infrastructure, which I'm the engineer, I'm the builder, that's what I'm going to be focusing on, but it's all those social services as well. Even in terms of job creation, even in terms of food deserts, we're trying to make sure that these communities have all the services available to them anywhere throughout the city. But we continue to have the challenge of gentrification, and that's why the mayor said, let's identify these 6 communities, let's see if we can provide all the services we can to them, both public health all the way through to infrastructure, and to see if we can maintain the viability of that neighborhood.
I would just add, Congressman, it's a big challenge. Over our careers, on one hand, people will say, we want our neighborhoods to look like the more affluent neighborhoods. And then when we invest the resources and people come in who are more affluent, that leads to gentrification issues that some people have problems with. As it relates to disaster recovery, it's a particular problem because some people, if they have the option of selling their home, where will they move? And for a place as big as Houston or Harris County, as you know, having gone to Prairie View, it's so spread out. That is a real challenge. I'm encouraging my colleagues, now that I'm in county government, as I did when I was in city government, to think outside the box. On one hand, obviously, we look to the federal government for help. But on the other hand, sometimes in local communities, we have to be willing to put some skin in the game. So as opposed to being a traditional county commissioner where I'm just asking for money for roads, I'm trying to convince my colleagues that we ought to use some of our money for affordable housing and some of the non-traditional things instead of just looking to you all. And I did that when I was a council member, and each mayor has continued. They use about $20 million of local bond money. I think the last mayor, on your watch, cut it down to $18 million for affordable housing. So that's a big part of it. But look, it's a clear dichotomy. On one hand, people want their neighborhoods to be better. They want investments in those neighborhoods. And then when we do it, they're upset because other people want to come.
Gentleman, time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman From Colorado, the Vice Chair of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, Mr. Tipton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Wagner, and thank the panelists for all of your testimony here today. Ms. McFadden, I'd like to be able to maybe start with you. It's clear that the Department of Housing and Urban Development has less restrictive rules for states in its CDBG DR distribution because the states are going to be the pass-through entity for those funds. And because of this structure, states are given obviously the maximum feasible difference for their interpretation for distributing those funds. Do you believe that HUD can responsibly provide for the CDBG DR grantees with guidance and technical assistance with the maximum feasible deference standard in place?
Thank you for the question. And in the annual CDBG program that goes out every year, not for disasters, that maximum feasible deference is strong and respected throughout the program. Generally, after disasters, if the states are going to be administering funds directly, HUD puts in place a very different standard for the administration, which is much more like the rules that cities and counties have to observe. I think that the program has done a great job of ensuring fiscal accountability in the administration. However, as the other panelists have said, and I think many members of the public would agree, it's absolutely time to consider these issues through notice and comment rulemaking and giving the public an opportunity to weigh in. Doing a permanent authorization of the program would allow notice and comment rulemaking, which, for example, would go through clearance with the Office of the Inspector General, which could ensure that all the appropriate mechanisms are in place for the program.
Good. Is it your sense that HUD can monitor the CDBG DR grantees to be able to ensure performance and compliance?
Yes, sir. Both the HUD Office of Community Planning and Development and the Office of the Inspector General monitor the recipients of the funds. Okay,
so you're comfortable with that. Might have a little issue. I think we might want to make sure that we're getting some of that accountability in place, but I'd like to be able to maybe follow up with you on that just for a little more sense of you. And to your knowledge, has HUD ever overruled or otherwise told a grantee that its interpretation of the CDBG DR statutory requirement is incorrect?
I think that there have absolutely been moments where interpretations of policy have been different, and HUD ultimately has ruled against the initial interpretation of the state, if that's what you're asking, sir, yes.
Okay, so we do have some examples. And do you think that more structure is needed from HUD or from Congress on the distribution of the CDBG DR grants?
Yes, I absolutely do. I think communities would be served better and taxpayer dollars would be used more efficiently if more were done to formalize the program.
Okay, great. And just finally, do you have any suggestions on exactly how we might be able to bring some greater accountability to the block grant model after the funds have been distributed out to the grantees?
So at this moment, HUD's greatest influence is in setting the rules and approving the plans as they come in, because HUD has limited resources to do the monitoring that I mentioned, and the Inspector General has limited resources to do that monitoring. I think an investment in HUD's own administration could prove a real strengthening of the program because they'd be able to look much more closely at the way the programs are being implemented.
Great. Well, and that's something, again, I think we'd like to be able to follow up on as we were talking just a couple of minutes ago in terms of that accountability and how the dollars are going to be spent. I think it's important that we do get that aid back. I think you'd noted in your testimony that you'd assisted in Colorado. You aren't exactly an incredibly flood-prone state. Our water runs off pretty quick. It's steep out there. But, you know, the importance of being able to get that help, but also to make sure that we are having the accountability that the dollars are going where they need to go to the people that they need to help is something I think is going to be important. So, again, Chair, I thank you for holding this hearing and yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The Chair now recognizes my dear friend, the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the chairwoman and to our ranking member and to all of those who came as witnesses today. Let me just say thank you for your written and your oral presentations. I found them very helpful, but let me just say join my colleagues in thanking you, and I don't know to call you commissioner, state senator, and I'm going to add another one, chief of staff to our late and former good friend, Congressman Mickey Leland. He would be very proud today with you going from chief to sitting here where he fought so hard for those who was in need, whether it was for food or housing. So thank you for the work you did then and what you're doing now. History certainly does repeat itself. Just for a little clarification to my congressman, to my left statement about where I live, I'm going to also include the chairwoman because we live in the same building. And history does really repeat itself. Coming some 7 years later, after Congressman Cleaver was here, we did the exact same thing. The only difference is where we live now is the most affordable to live now, and as we want to buy in that same vicinity, it's not affordable. So 7 years has made a huge difference to those. So when I think about those who are in need, and I think about those who have been displaced, certainly I know when you think about what happened in Katrina. And according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the United States has a shortage of some 7.2 million rental homes affordable and available to extremely low income renters. In my district, in the 3rd Congressional District in our capital of Ohio, Columbus, there's some 30,000 people currently on the waiting list for rental assistance with our city's public housing authority. So when I think about Hurricane Katrina, and I visited New Orleans during that time and years afterwards, to your point, 7 years later after Ike, we're still fighting for those folks to have housing. I didn't get to Texas or to Houston, but more recently I was in Puerto Rico. So when I think about all your statements, I guess I'd like to ask each of you, if I could do one thing for this legislation that would help those in need, what would it be? So think about that. And then to Ms. McFadden, I found it very interesting in one of your statements in your testimony when you talked about that those residents should, that at 120% of the median should apply first for the small business loan before the CDBG. I don't have the exact quote from it here, but you're nodding, so I assume you know what that reference is. How does that work for someone in Puerto Rico when you think about the poverty that's there? If you can quickly give me that, then I'll go to Mr. Ellis and the other witnesses for the one thing.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and I think you went immediately to the caveat I would put on that recommendation. So for the other members of the subcommittee, my recommendation would be that before grant dollars could flow to a family at 120% of area median income or higher for the need that they have left after any insurance or other assistance, that they apply for a below-market homeowner loan from the Small Business Administration. And in most communities, that means that the Small Business Administration will make a decision about whether that family can afford to repay. Because I believe, as a matter of good public policy, that the taxpayer dollars should go first to those who are unable to use other resources that they can repay on their own before assisting the general public. The challenge in Puerto Rico is that the area median income is so low that you may still find people below the poverty level. So I would look forward to some discussion about how to make it workable there.
Okay, thank you. Others, Mr. Ellis.
I became Congressman Leland's AA in '81. It was a long time ago when you called the chief of staff AA. Things were, we were so poor and he was so poor, I was his AA and his roommate. And if we had bought a place in Waterside Towers back then, I'd be a wealthy county commissioner now.
Yes.
I think the most important thing you can do is preserve that 70 low and moderate income standard with the discretion being given to the secretary to reduce it to the 50%, but it would be transparent. They'd have to make the case. I just want to stress that point. My years in city, state, and county government, folks who need stuff the most generally are not the best organized to advocate for themselves, and I think we'd be best pressed to go ahead and take it at 50% every time if we had that discretion.
Thank you. My time is over, so I'm sorry, but I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and we do, in our legislation, currently keep that 70%. So, the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Laudermilk, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the panel for being here. This is an important issue. It isn't probably one that's going to make the headlines of the New York Times today, unless the chairwoman decides to tweet it out. Then maybe we'll get.
I'm all over that.
But this is very important, especially in the time that we're in. I think it's time for us as a congressional body to relook at the way we do a lot of things, because some things that we've done in the past have not worked very well, and we've driven ourselves to a $21 trillion debt, so we can no longer look at just funding our way out of problems without making significant changes. And one of the things I think we have to do is look at how we can make the dollars that we spend more effective and make them go further. And I remember something that my parents used to tell me, and my grandparents, and I think they had a lot of wisdom, that if we went back to those old sayings, they can help us out a lot. And one of those is, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And Ms. McFadden, you brought up in your testimony the idea of mitigation, which is something we haven't looked at the National Flood Insurance Program, of mitigation. And that's intriguing, because I'd like to know your thoughts on, implementing mitigation standards such as the elevation and construction standards, because to me, I would think you can spend a whole lot less money preventing a disaster than actually rebuilding after a disaster. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Elevation and construction standards, absolutely a critical piece at the individual property level, and I would also encourage, in thinking about any permanent authorization or future appropriations, some guidance to HUD on how to think about the balance between individual properties and community-wide infrastructure projects. There's a tension in how to protect the entire community and how to go building by building. So the elevation standards do keep people and property safer from harm when the next storm comes, but sometimes doing a community-wide solution may be more effective across the board.
So is it your understanding or your belief that we could save a substantial amount of money by investing a little bit of money on the front end?
Absolutely, and I applaud Congress in the most recent CDBG-DR allocation for dedicating funds for mitigation and making a true investment in doing that, so that we're not paying again for the same places.
I appreciate that. And another area that I think that we can make the money that we have go further, especially in certain communities, comes to the environmental standards. When we had a recent event back home where there was a development going in, but it was something the entire community wanted to bring in. And I went to those who were doing this. It was several private and nonprofit organizations coming in, and I said, what can we do to help? Because there was going to have to be a lot of infrastructure changes, including road modifications, building roads. I said, what can I do in Congress to help? And they came to me and said, please don't do anything. And I said, why? They said, we can't afford to receive federal funding for these road projects because they would take too long and cost us too much money. And I said, why? I said, we can build these roads for 60% less money and 60% faster if we just use state funds, because we avoid the onerous reporting requirements and study requirements of these environmental standards. Do you see that we can save some money by streamlining some of these processes that we go through regarding disaster response and recovery?
That's a frustration that's been shared by many communities around the country as they've tried to put state dollars together with federal dollars, where even across the federal government, agencies may have different or conflicting standards in implementing the same environmental protection laws and historic preservation and related laws. So absolutely there are opportunities for streamlining, and over time through the appropriation of CDBG DR dollars, Congress has made a little bit more flexibility available so that if, for example, HUD dollars follow a FEMA environmental review, then there's some streamlining there. But there still is much opportunity to make it faster, particularly in the realm of large-scale infrastructure projects, as you mentioned, and in single-family home renovations.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, for 5 minutes. Oh.
I'm yielding to Mr. Green, I think.
I thank the gentleman very much. Like to, if I may, just compliment you, Mr. Gonzalez, on your outstanding work on the committee. We greatly appreciate what you've done to benefit not only your constituents in your congressional district, but also the state of Texas. You have truly been one of the outstanding assets. Madam Chair, if I may, I'd like to introduce into the record, without objection, of course, a letter that is dated to the Honorable Director Mick Mulvaney, Office of Management and Budget. And if I may, I'd like to also read one sentence of the 6-paragraph letter that captures the essence of what the letter is all about. It reads, "We write today urging you to approve the direct allocation of the appropriated share of Community Development Block Grant Disaster Relief Funds." And that's an important sentence. It's an important sentence directed to the Director of the Budget of Office of Management and Budget, because of who has signed the letter. The letter is signed by, of course, the Honorable Kevin Brady, who is a member from Texas, by the Honorable Greg Abbott, the Governor of the state of Texas, the Honorable John Cornyn, United States Senator from Texas, the Honorable Ted Cruz, United States Senator from Texas, the Honorable George P. Bush, Land Commissioner, State of Texas, Harris County Judge Ed Emmett, the Honorable Harris County Judge Ed Emmett, the Honorable Mayor Sylvester Turner, and those of us who are from the Houston delegation, including Mr. Culberson, Mr. Gene Green, Ms. Jackson Lee, Mr. McCall, Mr. Olson, Mr. Poe, and I'm honored to be a person who has signed it as well. May I so enter?
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, just as a matter of housekeeping, I'd like to let people know that earlier when I spoke about my having had a degree associated, well, not a degree, that's what I want to clear up, having had an association with engineering, I did attend engineering school, but I want people to know that I'm a dropout. I really don't want to have to deal with tomorrow the press accosting me about, "I thought you said you didn't finish college."
So noted in the record.
Thank you. Now, I'm also pleased that Texas Southern University at the Thurgood Marshall School of Law saw something in me that I didn't see in myself and gave me the opportunity to attend law school. So I do have what we call a Juris Doctorate, which is really a Juris Doctor. I'm honored to have such a degree. Moving along, Mr. Martin and Ms. McFadden, when I mentioned earlier the prowess of the people who had the hands-on experience, I in no way wanted to minimize the intellectual prowess that you bring to this forum. That's exceedingly important, and you've both given me much to consider. So let me go to you, if I may, Ms. McFadden. You mentioned something that I'm fascinated with, this concept of an off-the-shelf regulations that could benefit smaller venues. Could you elaborate, please?
Thank you. I'd be pleased to. The flexibility of the regular CDBG program allows the 1,200 jurisdictions that receive the funds to design programs the way they want to, as long as they fit within the guardrails. But this means that there are many, many choices and challenges they have to face in trying to scale up their existing programs when they move from CDBG to CDBG disaster recovery. And then they have to question whether HUD will approve the choices they're making. If HUD were to do the design up front and pre-approve programs after a disaster, when the elected officials and others administering government programs are facing very difficult choices, they could have certainty and a safe harbor in knowing that they have the best program available to them and adopt that wholesale.
Have you had any experience in crafting such a paradigm?
After Hurricane Sandy, HUD made some model programs available, but without doing any notice and comment about how to improve them, and I think got them available a little bit too late for communities to really adopt because they were already off and running with their own programs. There is something to build on, but I think it needs some further improvement before it can really be ready to go.
Thank you. Now, as a good ranking member, I have to do something that's very important to one of the members from my side. Ms. Beatty asked about that one thing that you would have us focus on, and a couple of you didn't, perhaps as many as 3, didn't have the opportunity to respond to that question. So it's my duty now to make sure that that gets taken care of. So we'll start with Mr. Costello. The one thing, please, and by the way, you have about 19 seconds.
Thank you,
I'm
Congressman.
over 19 seconds.
And so to highlight community expectation, the one thing would be to expedite funding directly to the recipient so that we can deliver the services that we need to deliver, whether it's housing, to get people back into housing, or whether it's infrastructure to mitigate for future floods.
So as not to abuse my time, Madam Chair, I'll yield back because I'll have 5 additional minutes later.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman and the ranking member to allow an interloper on your committee today to come and hear this very interesting presentation, and thanks for holding this oversight hearing. You know, this is such important work, and the need for flexibility and speed in the cities, which you've all talked about, and the counties is so important, and that's sort of been one of the positive things over many, many years of the CDBG program. But in this disaster arena, we have, sometimes it's not shaped according to standard policy, and therefore there's a lot of things that get missed between the goals of the program and the success of the program. So I'm here today on behalf of the taxpayers to ask, how do we safeguard these funds and not have GAO reports that tell us that we're still looking for $750 million of CDBG disaster funds after Katrina that cannot be accounted for? So let's, Mr. Costello, maybe talk from the City of Houston's point of view, Mr. Ellis too. How do we get the money to a public entity that has public accountability to the taxpayer, and then but out in an effective way where it's not used for an unintended purpose, or it's just not handled right? $750 million is a lot of money, and I think taxpayers really, we owe it to them to not let that happen again.
And that's a very valid question, Congressman, and I think it depends upon the expertise of the recipient. As Commissioner Ellis had described, I mean, and I did as well, the city is a very large organization. We're the 4th largest city. We have 22,000 employees. Combined public work and housing, we have over 4,500 employees. We have the ability and the expertise to make sure that we are in full compliance, assuming we get direct allocation. The issue that I'm concerned about as an engineer in providing the mitigation dollars for infrastructure is the community expectations on how long it's taking us to get to a particular project and to implement that project. Personally, I'm not looking forward to August of 2018 when the public and the media says to the city and the county, what have you done post the Hurricane Harvey? And we really haven't been able to show very much other than maybe modifying some of our building standards for future construction, elevating them above the base flood elevation so they protect those future houses. We still have to address the houses that were flooded themselves. But to get back to you, specifically to your question, it's really a function of the expertise of the recipient.
Well, I saw it. I was a volunteer in helping rebuild houses in Lacombe, Louisiana after Katrina, and people were going back in. They didn't have a mortgage, so they weren't in the flood program, but they just went right back in their same house that's built below the floodplain. And a lot of the misallocated money, I think, in CDBG in that time period, DF, were monies that were extended to people for raising above the base floodplain, but it wasn't spent for that purpose. And yet we know that for taxpayers in the flood program and for city, county taxes, property taxes, and family livelihood, that's an important feature. So I just am interested from an auditor point of view. How do we, Mr. Ellis, maybe you take a shot at how do we maintain Houston, Harris County? I'm a former Harris County resident, thank you very much. I lived there during Hurricane Allen a long time ago. But how do we maintain that audit trail? How do we convince the American taxpayers that we'll get it out and we'll make a lasting improvement and not see the money squandered?
It's a very good question. I'm a former resident of Louisiana, by the way. I attended Xavier my freshman year. But, you know, I think the key is the clawback provisions. It's transparency. It's when you see a problem, do just what you're doing now. Raise it. Mm-hmm. You know, look, when I was running for city council in '83, the city had to give back some CDBG money, and I ran on it. And then when I got there, I did realize how difficult it is to spend money and spend it the right way. Mm-hmm. So if there's a direct allocation, all of the strings should be on a city or on a county that would be there if it went through the state. But it's that transparency. If I could figure out how we could end corruption in public life, I'd be over there in the White House. You know, I'd run myself, but you gotta stay honest. It's that transparency, regardless of who gets the money.
Well, I think that's important for OMB and for HUD and for our state and local officials, and we look forward to partnering with you, and we thank you for being here today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back. I now want to recognize, to close us out, the ranking member, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes, and I want to, in advance, give my apologies. I have a markup in Foreign Affairs, a very important genocide and atrocities piece of legislation that I've been working on for some time. So I am going to dash to Foreign Affairs. I will leave it to the Vice Chair, Mr. Tipton, to close things out. But I want to yield the gentleman, the ranking member from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes, and thank him for his collaboration on this endeavor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I greatly respect the fact that you have multiple assignments today, which is not unusual for you. You seem to have a multiplicity of things that you're doing quite constantly, so I appreciate greatly what you've allowed us to accomplish today, and hope that things will go well with you in your next venue. With reference to the one question, let me now go to, I believe there may be one or two others. If you have not answered that one question, all right, would you kindly do so? And I think, Mr. Martin, did you have an opportunity to respond to it? Okay, we'll start.
To answer first. So Congresswoman Beatty's earlier comments regarding the experiences of community development and community change speak directly to CDBG-DR's role as being this bridge between disasters and what's actually happening in the communities before a disaster occurs and long after. So I would encourage the move towards thinking of the eligible activities in CDBG-DR, if it were to reach a permanent statutory, be given permanent statutory authority, to include those multifamily rental housing activities that are currently eligible in CDBG-DR and focus on those as much as the other single-family recovery programs.
Thank you. The lady?
So I definitely agree with my colleagues here. The flexibility of the CDBG program is what makes it really, really the program to put these disaster recovery funds into. The flexibility in the program allows us to tailor our recovery to the needs that we suffered. And it allows us to do exactly what a city needs to be done versus a rural area versus someone who is impacted directly by a hurricane or someone who sat underwater for months. So the CDBG program is the right program for this. But the CDBG regulations right now do not define disaster recovery. So I think a permanent regulation, keeping all of the flexibility possible for the CDBG-DR program would be the absolute answer to this ongoing funding that we're going to continue to need, particularly in the state of Texas.
Thank you very much. I have had the opportunity to give testimony in my lifetime, and at the end of the hearing, there was something that I really wish that I had said that I did not say because I thought it was exceedingly important. So what I'd like to do now is give each of you an opportunity. If there's something that you think that you didn't say that you really would like to say so that you won't leave and have that afterthought, if you'll kindly make mention of it at this time. And if you can be terse and laconic, I'll get through so that everybody will have an opportunity, if you would.
Thank you, Congressman. I think when we talk about HUD and we talk about disaster relief, we have to look at it both in terms of housing and also in terms of mitigating infrastructure. And I do appreciate what the federal government is doing, focusing on both those issues. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. 2 words, more money. I'll yield back to balance of
Yes.
I agree as well. Mitigation is very important in these programs. As we've been improving homes, we have seen the need to not have to go back to those homes again. As we've improved infrastructure, we have seen that homes don't flood any longer because of the infrastructure that we were able to put in place with these funds.
I would recommend better integration across the federal agencies that deal with disaster response. This is certainly clear between HUD, CDBG-DR, and the FEMA programs, and particularly relating to the increased resources and funding going to mitigation at HUD. Coordination with FEMA's mitigation programs would also be helpful.
And I recommend that Congress act with urgency. 2017 was a particularly bad year for disasters, but we know that bad years will come again. So act now to make these changes to the program and ensure that as the last source in line, that CDBG-DR dollars are available to reach the people who need them the most.
Thank you. And with my last 30 seconds, I will thank all of you for appearing today. Want you to know that you have been exceedingly helpful. My staff has taken copious notes, and we'll be visiting about some of the things that we can integrate into legislation such that it won't just be an appearance, it'll be an opportunity for you to have made a difference. Again, I thank the ranking member, I thank the chairwoman, and also want to thank Mayor Turner. When I approached him about attending and giving his testimony, he said, I'm going to send the best person, and that would be my czar. Those were his words. So Mayor Turner, thank you very much for sending the czar, and thank all of you for your attendance. And again, to the chair lady, I thank you for the cooperation that we've received. I'm looking forward to bringing this to fruition. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and I'd like to thank all of our witnesses again for your testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as they are able. This hearing is now adjourned.